next on The Michael Duke Show.
Dr. Tim Ball is going to be joining us. He is a renowned environmental consultant and an award-winning former climatology professor. He's going to be talking with us about the time is now to publicly debunk the science underlying the UN climate plans for the Iccc and everything else. Dr. Tim Ball up next on your home for Common Sense Radio, The Michael Duke Show, Oldies 102.1 and AM 700 KBYR.
Defending your right to be offended. The Michael Duke Show on AM 700 KBYR and Oldies 102.1.
Welcome back to the program, your home for Common Sense Radio, The Michael Duke Show. Your home for Common Sense Radio. Dr. Tim Ball, Timothy Ball, is a renowned environmental consultant and an award-winning former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada. He is here today to talk with us a little bit about climate change and all these UN climate plans. And as I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that got out there early on that didn't get much traction in the mainstream media, because I don't think it really fit their narrative, was the fact that there were several prominent scientists involved with the Iccc, the International Panel on Climate Change, that was the UN organization, that all of a sudden changed their tune when they discovered that a lot of the data had been massaged and basically it was all outcome-based stuff, that if the data didn't match whatever they wanted the outcome to be, they jettisoned it and they changed it. And a lot of these scientists were outraged by the fact that the scientific process had basically been hijacked by politics. It didn't really make much news, but even though these some of these were very prominently in the climate change camp and had since said, well, we still think that climate change could be real, but we really need real data. We need real science, not political science. Dr. Timothy Ball joins us to discuss this, Paris Accords, and more. Good morning, Dr. Ball.
Good morning, and I should start with a disclaimer, Michael, in that I have 3 lawsuits against me. One of them is I simply agreed to withdraw what I wrote, but the other 2 are ongoing, and all 3 of them are by members of the Iccc. And in fact, I've got to be in court in Canada here in October on one of them by one of the main authors of the computer models. So this is the level at which this thing has reached. And by the way, my view of it is that, not just a view, but of all the evidence, this is the largest fake news story of all, because they've deceived the whole world about the role of CO2.
Right. Well, and quite honestly, it's cost taxpayers around the world, not just in the U.S., but around the world, billions and billions of dollars to try and come up with these things. And if the whole thing is based on flawed and junk science, that makes it very difficult to defend. What are your assertions on these models that they're using? And I mean, why are they? I'm assuming that they're suing you because you said that they were basically wrong and deceptive, and they're saying no, we were all doing the right thing.
Yeah, well, one of the lawsuits is by Michael Mann, who was the guy that produced the famous or infamous hockey stick. This was a graph that supposedly showed temperatures didn't change for 1,000 years, and then suddenly there was an upturn in the 20th century. And I gave a public presentation explaining what he had done and how he had done it and what was wrong with it all. And then in an interview afterwards, I was asked what I thought about what he'd done, and I flippantly said, he's at Penn State, but it's more likely he should be at State Penn. And I got a defamation lawsuit within 12 hours. And of course, this is the issue, is that they attack the individual rather than deal with the questions that are being made about their science. But the whole thing was set up from the start. And one of the things that I and many people think that commissions of inquiry are great things. The reality is that commissions of inquiry are the perfect vehicle for politicians to avoid the issue. And the reason for that is that people say, oh, good, a commission of inquiry, we got the politics out of the issue. But then the politicians go back and connive with the bureaucrats, and of course that's a major part of this whole story is the unaccountable bureaucrats that were used and still working in all of this. They connived to create a definition in terms of reference that effectively determined the outcome. And that's precisely what happened with the IPCC. They wrote their definition of climate change that they're working on is only human causes. And that, of course, restricts what you look at very, very narrowly. And not only that, but you can't possibly identify human causes if you don't know what natural causes are and how much they vary over time. So
right.
This was contrived right from the start.
Well, and I know that there's been discussions about the number of reporting stations as far as where the temperatures are taken, ignoring data from certain stations or basically meaning data across a set of series to make it look better. There's been a whole slew of issues that they, on their faces, they haven't really responded to. Like you said, instead they attack the messenger. Oh, you're just a heretic. Essentially, you're a scientific heretic if you don't believe in what we believe in.
Well, this attacking individuals and the other what goes on nowadays is that you don't just attack the individual, but you create a group name into which you can dump these people. The classic one, of course, is the Obama birthers. You know that you're a birther, and I don't know whether you can have a collective ad hominem, whether that's a contradiction in ideas. But with me, it was I was a global warming skeptic. And a few others that were fighting this were called skeptics. But the truth is all scientists are skeptics. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. And then when they changed from global warming to climate change, which occurred in about 2003, and there are leaked emails, by the way, of these people talking about this, saying the global warming issue is starting to be ridiculed because we've got cold winters, and Alaska experienced that. And so they stopped calling it global warming and started calling it climate change. Well, then they started calling us climate change deniers, with all of the Holocaust connotations attached to that. And then, of course, if all of those fail, you simply say, oh, they're conspiracy theorists. Right. Well, the problem is conspiracies do occur, and certainly this one to demonize CO2 and to shut down industrialized nations and affect the world's economies is a conspiracy. There's no question about it.
Well, as they always say, follow the money. People say, well, why would they have a conspiracy to do this? Well, because it's very lucrative. I mean,
no, but Michael, I'm going to interrupt you there. Sorry, but yes, the money is true up to a certain point. So if you want to pay off scientists or you want to buy people in middle management or bureaucrats, yes, but at a certain level, it becomes about power. It is the power, and now people that are after the power know that the money will come with that. But their objective is the power that this provides, and of course, that in politics is really what it's all about. Is do you have the power to influence and create the politics that you want? You know, the Canadian Conrad Black, who was put in jail in the U.S. for his shenanigans, and they said to him one day, "Why aren't you in politics?" And he said, "I don't need to be." Which, of course, is a wonderful, one of those comments that the more you think about it, the more it tells you everything you need to know. Right. What he's saying is, I have all the power and influence I need. I don't need the politics. I don't need the money.
Right.
And that's the issue.
Your assertion on CO2, give us a little bit of background on that, because, of course, that's the whole crux of it, right? We're just all these CO2s being produced, and it's killing everyone and everything. What's your assertion on it?
Well, the original, the actual goal is not climate change. The climate change and global warming was simply the vehicle that they used to tell people that industrialized nations are destroying the planet by causing runaway global warming. Their real objective is that that the world is overpopulated. And they took the Malthusian, Thomas Malthus, the 19th century scientist, who said that the world, the population would outgrow the food supply. Well, they said that the population would outgrow all of the resources. And they said we've got to start limiting population, but we've particularly got to eliminate the industrialized nations who are using resources at a greater rate than anybody else. And, of course, that with a finger there pointed specifically at the U.S. And the question, Maurice Strong, the Canadian, in an interview, they said, well, what's the problem? He said, the problem for the planet is the industrialized nations. Isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Well, how do you do that? and this is the evil genius of these people. They can come up with methods and ways of persuading the public. So what they decided was, look, these countries are using the resources. They've become wealthy using fossil fuels, and we'll simply create the science to show that the fossil fuels they're burning is producing CO2, and that's causing runaway global warming. That's why CO2 became the focus, even though it's only 4% of all the greenhouse gases. Water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse effect, and yet they effectively ignore it. And the way they do that is they say, well, yes, humans produce water vapor, and they put it in the atmosphere, but the amount that humans produce relative to the total amount is insignificant. Therefore, we'll assume the water vapor doesn't vary. That then allows us to focus on the CO2.
Right.
And one of the ways you do that, of course, is you write computer models that prove your theory. So they wrote computer models that said if you increase CO2, the temperature goes up. The reality is, and I know this from my research of historical climates, in every single record we've got, the temperature increases before the CO2. The only place in the world where a CO2 increase causes a temperature increase is in the computer models of the Icsc.
Which, again, goes right back to discarding data that doesn't match with their outcomes that they're looking for. And again, as you said, if they don't go into these things with an open mind, I mean, having a theory is one thing. Having a zealous belief is something completely different, and that's really what it's come down to. It's not, I mean, this is almost kind of a Galilean kind of issue where you've got, the heretic looking out and saying, oh, no, we circle the sun. It doesn't circle us, and everybody else just gasps in the room and cries, denier, heretic. They want to burn him at the stake. And we see that going on. And some of these, by the way, some of the people who have, over the last 3 or 4 years, who have converted over to the idea of being skeptical, these were luminaries in this organization. All of a sudden have said, whoa, that doesn't follow scientific reason and procedure.
Well, the problem is that most of them, even though they were involved in the Icsc, were only dealing with one small part of it. And they never stopped to look at the overall thing that was going on. And to be very honest with you, I'm afraid that too many of them are simply rats deserting the sinking ship. And because they see now with Trump coming out and cutting the funding, and they're all scrambling for their jobs and their careers. But how come they didn't know, like I did 30 years ago, that this was a complete scam? And where were they, these IPCC people who won Nobel Prizes? And Gore's out there, who's also an IPCC winner, or a Nobel winner, and he's saying, sea level's going to rise by 20 feet. And they had to know that was wrong, but not one of them spoke out against the misinformation and in fact, deliberate lies that Gore was telling. So I'm very skeptical about these people that are now coming forward. And they talk about 97% of scientists, that the so-called consensus. Well, consensus has nothing to do with science. As Einstein said, I could have 100 facts prove me right. I've only got to have one fact prove me wrong, and it's all over.
Right.
And I think it's more proper to say that 97% of scientists have never looked at what the IPCC reports are saying and doing. And one of them that did look at it, and one of the people you're talking about, Klaus Eckhart Pulse, a German physicist and meteorologist, he said 10 years ago I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. See, because these scientists couldn't believe that other scientists would cheat and lie. And he said, one day I started checking the facts and data. First I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense and was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist I made presentations of their science without first checking it.
Right.
Scientifically, it is sheer absurdity to think we can get a nice climate by turning a CO2 adjustment knob.
Right. We're talking with Dr. Tim Ball, by the way, who's a climate specialist, a former professor at the University of Winnipeg, and that's exactly right, because this is almost like it's precedent setting. When these people start putting out papers and doing all this other stuff, of course, it's then used as a basis for decisions and for other experiments and projects. And if they're using flawed data from the very beginning, you're always going to have flawed outcomes in the end.
Yes, and they started making actual predictions, forecasts, in the 1990 report, which was the first IPCC report. They were 400% wrong in that 1990 report. And so they looked at it and said, well, how can we get past this problem of our forecast being wrong? Because they knew that if your forecast is wrong, your science is wrong. End of story. And so in 1995, they changed, and they stopped doing predictions. They started doing what they call projections. So they gave a range of potential temperature increases. But all of them showed a temperature increase. Not one of them showed a decrease.
Right.
And of course, that was because the computer models were programmed that way. And so since 1990, every single forecast they have made, or prediction or projection, I don't care what you call it, every single one they've made has been wrong. And of course, one of the things that I used to do, talking with farmers whose their whole operations affected by the climate and by government policies, and I say, you phone the weather office and say, what's it going to be like a year from now? And they say, oh, we don't do long-term forecasts.
Right.
You phone them the next day and say, what's it going to be like 50 years from now? They say, oh, warming.
Right.
Say, well, how come you can't forecast a week or a year from now, but you're so certain about 50 or 100 years from now?
Right.
And this exposes the fallacy of what's going on.
Dr. Tim Ball has been our guest. Dr. Ball, I appreciate you coming on. Folks, we'll check you out. We'll link up to your site and get you. And I'd like to have you back on later on to discuss this and talk more about it. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for airing all sides of the issue and allowing the people to make up their own mind.
And that's what we do. We attempt to get all sides so that people can get the facts and decide. The Michael Duke Show, AM 700 KBYR, Oldies 102.1.